Good evening, Council. Thank you for having me here this evening. It is an honor to share with you more about the Oakdale Cemetery Historic District, which was listed to the National Register of Historic Places on April 15th of this year. So this truly has been a team effort, and I can't think of a better way to cap off Historic Preservation Month than to share with you about this accomplishment. To share with you a little bit about what it is, it encompasses 45 acres of land, including the Oakdale Cemetery, the Oakdale Public Vault, which is in the southeastern parcel there, the Potter's Field, which is the triangular parcel up separated by the railroad tracks from the main boundary, and the Henderson Vault, which is near the receiving vault in the southeast quadrant. So this may look a little bit different than what we think of as a historic district. So they can take many different forms, and we'll look into what it's made up of and why it got listed. It consists of, the contributing resources make up a district, so it consists of the Oakdale Cemetery itself. Land was purchased in 1879, development began in 1880, and it was dedicated later that same year. That was followed by an architectural feature called the Oakdale Public Vault, which is a Gothic-style building, which was used to house bodies or store bodies until they could be properly buried and to protect them from resurrectionists. The Potter's Field, so it often goes unnoticed, but if you drive out Raymond Road towards the reservoir, it's the area of the flat grassy area on the left. There's a few indistinct metal markers there, but that is the Potter's Field, which is a burial place for paupers. And the Henderson Vault, another Gothic-style structure located also on the cemetery grounds. So to be on the National Register of Historic Places, you have to demonstrate some kind of significance. What's significant about these and why are they important? I did this graphic because typically we think of a building or a structure or an object, which is just one small bit of it. And so there's often a much bigger story to tell. In this case, we get into landscape design, which brings us out into the broader cemetery area. And then expanding upon that, community planning and development. So how our cemetery tied into the development of our community and the bigger area involved with that. Cemeteries are not typically listed on the National Register. They can be, but there's certain exceptions that have to take place because by nature, cemeteries have a lot of old things, so you have to show significance and some significance in some other way. In this whole process, many of you had the opportunity to hear about this in the early phases when I presented to council about the possibility of doing this. At that point, landscape design was not even a factor in this, and a question came up, who designed our cemetery? In digging through some archives, which we're very fortunate to have very good archives remaining at the cemetery office, it turns out that it was a gentleman named Herman Hareland, who was a nationally prominent landscape gardener. He was rooted in the ideals of Frederick Law Olmsted and the recuperative power of natural landscapes. So Olmsted is the designer of Central Park in New York City. So just to give you an idea, Hareland also was involved in circles with the Olmsted brothers. At times, they were all called out to give an opinion on a site or a location. So that was something that was uncovered and a bit surprising to me. It involved the use of natural landscape features and topography in the layout of the grounds and roads. It was part of what was called the moral therapy movement. So think of the late 1800s. This is post-Civil War. There was a lot of trauma in society, and so this healing nature of our surroundings. And so that's the tradition in which he comes from, which is also appropriate for a cemetery where we have complex feelings. He himself was also a veteran of the Civil War. So to put this into context, some, not all, but some of his other design work, the ridges, if you've been to Athens, to OU, the grounds were were once much more elaborate because there were farms, irrigation. I mean, he was very scientific, often had water features, drainage, more than just the design work. And this was part of the moral therapy movement. Let's treat the whole person. He was from Cincinnati. He had greenhouses about a mile from Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum. If you have been there, that is a very amazing place, which is also on the National Register. He was also involved in the early design of the Ohio State University campus and the Oval, back before it was actually called the Oval, but several iterations of design ended up being sort of the early set aside of that area known as the Oval, and the reason why we have to take that little curve on College Drive to get around the Oval. Little did I know that it had a connection to something that happened in Marysville. Also City Park in Chillicothe, which is definitely worth a visit if you haven't been there. As I mentioned, we have great archives still existing, although we don't have his original drawings with water features or shrubs or trees or anything like that. We have maps that date back to the late 1880s for sections B, C, and D, so you can see a bit of the design, the pathways that move through there, and the curving roads. Now, over time, you don't see that in the newer sections because over time that gets lost, so you'll see a distinct transition from the older sections to the newer sections. Keep in mind that this was densely forested at the time, so a lot of this work involved removing trees from the site, selecting what would stay and what would be removed, and keep in mind this very natural element, so you're not going to see a lot of, it's not going to look as curated. Just to give you a little tour, this is actually one of my favorite vantage points. You see the bridge, the curvy roads, and it's hard to imagine that right behind that is Kroger. And that is sort of the beauty of this design, that you don't know that you're surrounded by Route 33 and a lot of development. And I encourage you to head to the cemetery and walk around, and you'll see very many of these, and you'll find new things each time. In the background, you see the receiving vault there. And this is a ravine that runs through the cemetery, and the obelisk and one of the main sections. And here you see kind of a vista of a curving road, and that's the idea. You don't know what's coming around the corner. Okay, and then to the Oakdale Public Vault. This is a Gothic-style receiving vault designed by architect Ella Terrell, who has another property on another design on the National Register. It was built from locally sourced Berea sandstone, and it is the same stone that the courthouse was made of, because this was built approximately the same time as that. And for comparison, the photo on your left is the early 1900s, and the photo on your right is last year. So one thing about a National Register nomination, it has to maintain integrity, not just of a structure, but the feeling, the place, location. There's a lot of different criteria to say, hey, is this reflective of what it would have been like back then? So you can see how well maintained it is and in good condition. Looks a little bit different than a few years ago. The city has taken great efforts to do some biological cleaning. Again, that's something pretty superficial and just cleaned with gentle cleaners by a preservation firm, and you can see what a huge difference that is. The mortar was raked out and replaced with somebody who knew what type and color and kind, so that we don't have to hopefully worry about this again for a lot of years. So that is, it was great to be able to submit these photos with the National Register nomination. The next contributing feature is the Potter's Field. Again, not what we typically think of as a cemetery, but in historic preservation today, there's a much bigger effort in telling the entire story, not just looking at a building and saying, what great architecture. So at the same time, some bodies were protected in the receiving vault. Others were buried in a potter's field, very shallow graves. You see very basic markers. There's probably between 125 and 150 unmarked graves out there. Another example of community efforts, there used to be some shabby wooden markers out there, and in the early 1900s, a local machine shop owner thought they deserved better, and in his shop, he made these metal placards, which I believe it looks like they are the same ones that he would have made at that time. And again, a view from a little bit farther back. At the time this was developed, the railway did not go through there. And in 1893, the T&OC Railroad went through there, cut off this part of the property from the main cemetery. It was purchased by the infirmary a couple years later, where their burials took place. Another architectural feature, the Henderson Vault. Dr. Henderson is very well known around here. This particular vault was built by two brothers. They were both prominent citizens of Marysville. We know him as a physician, but Dr. Henderson was also a veteran of 2 wars. He was also a member of the Masonic fraternity here and was a skilled mason himself. And he took special delight in instructing and forming the younger crafts. So he was also teaching the younger generation masonry. And his residence is actually on the National Register and an example of a master at a trade, although they don't know exactly who the builder was or if he had anything to do with that. Now we get to that bigger circle, community planning and development, which I absolutely loved finding out about this part of it. So it is associated with the patterns of growth of late 19th century as rural populations outgrew their existing capacity and they had to adapt their infrastructure and public spaces to serve the growing needs of their population. That sounds pretty familiar to today, actually. So on the right side, you'll see the shaded area of Marysville, and that's where the old cemetery was. Up in this corner triangle is the plot of land where Oakdale Cemetery now resides. That's about a mile out. And just to give you some framework of how that development occurred. As we mentioned, he was in the Olmsted tradition. So, quote from Olmsted, "I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future." So this involved very careful site selection. This was also in a period where we had transition from rural cemeteries where individual families would maintain a plot to a movement of a memorial park type cemetery where they were comprehensively designed, managed, and maintained, which is the example that we see at Oakdale. This also relates to growth and development because although some graves were moved earlier from the old cemetery, when the railroad came through, it also caused anything left of the old cemetery to be relocated out to the new cemetery. So they were looking for an area that had exclusion and quietness, a bit remote from the city, but wouldn't be too inconvenient that people could actually get to it. And in that process of getting to it, as growth occurred, a boulevard was constructed to connect the town, recall from the map, to Oakdale Cemetery, and that was also called Oakdale Boulevard. That was intended to be a beautiful, picturesque road, and we're talking about what's now the western portion of 5th Street. It was a focal point of community activities and traditions. There were garden parties out there. There were horse races in the summer. There were sleigh races in the winter. Imagine getting out your sleighs on 5th Street. Stores would close down. People would congregate. Just an amazing place. And even in the old directories, the address was the boulevard in that area of town. It wasn't 5th Street. There were a lot of efforts by not just the village, but also residents to have walkways on the sides, trees, and at some point it was paved with a new service because this was really just the grand boulevard, really a highlight, intended to be a magnificent street. And so as we're always thinking to the future, I'd like to share with you what their intended vision for Oakdale was, and a lot of this comes from the dedication speech. It was to be one of the prettiest villages of the dead to be found in Ohio. It was to have a quiet, natural, and peaceful beauty, not necessarily grandeur, but just a succession of beautiful landscapes. They realized and acknowledged we don't have a Grand Canyon in Ohio, we don't have a Niagara Falls, but our beauty is a different kind of beauty, which is represented in Oakdale. Art was actually considered to be a very essential element to Oakdale Cemetery, and its ability to add to the beauty of nature. And they said the kind of beauty that we have, we can complement it with art, and also they were called landscape gardeners at the time, not landscape designers, and they were really considered artists of the land. The landscape was their palette. It was a place envisioned to be a place that the living would love to visit and where they would be overcome by thoughtfulness, well-paved and well-kept walks and drives, being able to wind among the trees, conducting the visitor to every part of that area. And over time, things change over time, as they did in the cemetery. So you'll see a photograph here of a 1906 entrance. Keep in mind, it opened in 1880. In 1906, they constructed a new entrance, and they had this fence extended approximately 500 feet along what's now 5th Street. And then on the right side is a side entrance. That's a remaining gate post. I took out the background so you do not see exactly where that is. Maybe some of you can envision where that is, but if you can't, take a look around, see if you can locate it. You might find a lot of other old things out there. If you're walking on 5th Street, you'll also see a concrete patch where the sexton's residence is no longer out there. But if you walk along, you can see where you can envision where that used to be. So it's an amazing place. And to leave you with this, they have done well, for they have planned not for the present only, but for the future. They have planned as though they have felt that they were the representatives not merely of the present citizens of Marysville, but of the generations that were to come after, as though they would merit the approval and gratitude of the thousands who, after they and you have been gathered to your fathers, shall look upon their work. I chose this quote because I surely think, being on the National Register of Historic Places, they would be proud and acknowledge that we are approving and grateful for the work that they did so many years back, thinking about our generations. So with that, I would like to thank you all. And as I mentioned, it was an amazing team effort supported by the city of Marysville. Jeremy was instrumental in helping with this process and some scanning and map assistance. Ron and Emma from the cemetery office. Mackenzie helped me dig into some archives and find some of this information. Natasha, as urban forester, came out, and in fact, her and Brandon, I think some of you heard on Arbor Day, looking to possibly make this one of the levels of arboretums. I thank the City Council and Cemetery Advisory Board a couple years ago when I shared a bit of my research with Councilman Berger that this could be a possibility, and he helped open up that forum with City Council and the Cemetery Advisory Board at the time, who found merit and found this to be a worthwhile effort. To Judge Parrott, who is the one who first brought the receiving vault to my attention, which is what this started to be, but ended up being something much more significant than that. Sue Keenbaum from the library, who helped. Now we have all the main resources digitized, so it's just been a huge accomplishment. Alana Fernandez, who helped with photographs. Photographing is a big deal for these nominations. Stephen Badenhop for scanning some of the larger maps, and so many countless resources, not only in Marysville, but actually nationwide, to get some of this information. So I think we're putting Marysville on the map in different ways, and appreciate the vision and thought that has gone into this.